Hey there, survivor. If you can hear this, it means you're still alive. This is Jack's Nightmares, and this is your next story. I didn't leave the city because I had a good plan. I left because the city stopped making sense. It wasn't one disaster or one bad night. It was the slow stacking of small failures that never got fixed. Power cuts that lasted longer each time. Water pressure dropping until taps barely worked above the first floor. Trash that stayed where it fell. Sirens that ran non-stop for weeks and then vanished like someone had finally given up. People changed without announcing it. Neighbors stopped holding doors. Then they stopped answering knocks. Candy noticed before I did. She started watching stairwells instead of windows. She learned which footsteps meant trouble and which ones didn't. Before everything collapsed, I worked maintenance and seasonal jobs. Warehouses, trail crews, fire support. I wasn't a leader, and I wasn't helpless. I knew how to fix simple things and how to tell when something was beyond saving. That mattered later. When systems failed, most people waited for instructions that never came. I didn't. I watched what still worked and what didn't. In the city, that meant moving supplies quietly, staying useful without being visible, and leaving places before they became crowded. Candy was with me through all of it. After the car accident years earlier, she was the only constant I had left. Feeding her, keeping her safe. That gave my days a shape even when everything else blurred together. The infected didn't end the city overnight. They were just another problem layered on top of everything else. At first they were slow, confused, easy to avoid if you paid attention. Later came the faster ones, the ones that still remembered how to move with purpose. You learned to read posture instead of faces. You learned that sound carried farther than you thought, especially between buildings. I kept Candy on a short lead indoors and trained her to stay behind me when we moved outside. A dog wants to protect you. I had to teach her that silence was protection now. I survived by staying boring. I didn't chase rumors. I didn't run toward gunfire. I worked for food when it made sense and left before people decided I owed them more. I slept in places no one wanted. Service corridors, locked stairwells, fenced utility yards. When things got worse, I started thinking about distance and height instead of walls. That's when the lookout tower came back to me. I'd spent one summer filling in for an injured watcher years earlier. Long days, quiet nights. One ladder between you and the ground. It wasn't comfortable, but it was controlled. Control started to feel more important than comfort. The morning I left, a building burned 2 blocks away, and no one came to put it out. Smoke drifted through the streets and people stood around filming it like it meant something. Candy wouldn't stop watching the windows. I packed before dawn with the lights off. Backpack, sleeping roll, tarp, stove, fuel I'd saved, filter, tools I actually knew how to use. No extras for peace of mind. Candy's harness went on last. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. Talking turns into bargaining, and bargaining gets you followed. I moved through alleys and service paths, places built to be ignored. I avoided groups and avoided anything that looked organized. Organized meant rules, and rules changed fast when food ran low. The first days were all walking. When I found a working car, it was by accident, and it didn't last. I used it to put miles behind me, not to feel safe. Drove during daylight, hid it at night. Slept far enough away that the engine cooling wouldn't give me away. When it died near the foothills, I took what I could carry and left the rest cached under brush and ash. Candy drank, I drank. We walked. The first tower was supposed to be the end of that walk. It wasn't. I smelled burned wood and rot before I saw it. The structure was gone. Beams snapped, ladder twisted, cab collapsed into itself. Some of it looked like storm damage. Some of it didn't. There were boot prints in the ash that didn't belong to weather. Someone had been there after it fell. Candy sniffed and whined once. I stopped her and walked the perimeter slow, looking for anything salvageable. There was nothing. I sat on a rock, drank water in careful sips, and stared at what used to be my plan. I didn't turn back. Turning back meant guessing, and guessing gets people killed. I remembered another tower, farther out. I'd only seen it once on satellite images and heard about it from other watchers when radios still worked. I knew the ridgeline and the fact it sat just off the crest to avoid wind. That was enough. I repacked, left what I couldn't carry, wrapped Candy's paws where the pads were splitting, and started walking again. The land between towers was worse than it looked. Burn scars flatten everything and hide hazards. Ash turns slick when it's wet. Dead trees fall without warning. Water sources I remembered were dry or fouled. I stayed high when I could, away from drainages that carry sound and smell. We saw infected but not many, which bothered me more than a crowd would have. Candy froze more than once, nose high, ears forward, and each time we detoured without testing our luck. By the third day, my shoulders were raw and my boots were starting to split. I stopped before mistakes crept in, ate before hunger, drank before thirst. At night, Candy slept pressed against my legs, head turned back the way we came. Late that afternoon, the ridge finally rose the way I expected. Trees thinned, wind shifted. Old cut stumps appeared, grey and split. I slowed down and scouted instead of rushing. From a shallow saddle, I saw it. The tower sat farther back than I wanted, but where it should be, just off the crest. Below it was a clearing that didn't look right. A sagging tarp, crude traps half collapsed, a fence line knocked over instead of taken apart. Bodies moved through the debris, slow and uncoordinated. The smell reached even where I stood. Rot and old waste, mixed with something animal. I didn't move closer. Not yet. I stayed low in the trees and let the wind tell me what it wanted to tell me. Candy stiffened under the harness, weight shifting forward, nose high. I pulled her back with steady pressure and kept her tucked behind my leg. She didn't fight it. She knew that posture meant waiting. I stayed still long enough that my legs started to complain. Then longer. I counted the infected. 5 that I could see clearly. Maybe more in the blind spots behind the fallen fence and the slope under the tower. They wandered in short loops, bumping into debris, stopping for no reason, then drifting again. None of them looked fresh. Clothes were stiff with dried filth. Movement was uneven, but persistent. The kind that doesn't get tired. The camp told a story even without words. Someone had tried to stay here. Not long-term, but long enough to build traps and think about perimeter control. The traps were wrong. Too loud. Too shallow. Designed by someone who wanted to catch something without understanding what would come to the noise. The fence wasn't torn down from the outside. It had collapsed inward in places, like it had been pushed through during a rush or abandoned halfway through reinforcing. I could see torn fur near the edge of the clearing. Deer or elk, maybe a dog. Whatever it was, it had bled here. I watched the tower windows for movement. Nothing. No light. No shadow shifts. The ladder was intact from what I could tell, running straight up to the cab. The door at the top looked closed. That didn't mean much. A closed door just means someone closed it last. It doesn't mean someone is still there to open it again. I scanned the tree line beyond the clearing, not just the obvious spots. Living people hide better than the dead. Living people also make mistakes when they think no one is watching. I backed away from the saddle and circled downwind, moving slow, using the terrain to keep the clearing out of sight while I repositioned. I didn't want to commit from the front. If I had to go in, I wanted options. The ground was uneven, burned in places, soft in others where ash had mixed with rain. I tested each step before shifting my weight. Candy moved when I moved, stopped when I stopped. She'd learned that rhythm over months of avoiding attention. I found a vantage point partway down the slope where I could see the camp from a different angle. From there, I spotted something I hadn't seen before. A body near the tarp that wasn't moving like the others. It was slumped against a crate, head tilted forward, jaw slack. Not infected yet, or already too damaged to reanimate properly. Hard to tell at this distance. Nearby, a pack lay open, contents scattered like someone had dumped it in a hurry. That kind of mess doesn't come from the dead. It comes from people under pressure. I stayed there for most of the afternoon. The infected patterns didn't change much. They drifted, bumped, paused. None of them climbed. None of them looked up for long. The wind stayed steady, which helped. What didn't help was the quiet. No birds. No small animals moving through. That meant the smell was doing its job. The clearing was poisoned ground. even if it wasn't obvious from a distance. By late afternoon, the light started to flatten, and shadows stretched in ways that made movement harder to read. I didn't want to be caught halfway through a decision when dark set in. I had 3 options, none of them good. I could back out and camp away from the tower, risk losing track of it in the morning, and risk someone else moving in overnight. I could try to draw the infected away, which meant noise and attention I didn't want. Or I could go in quiet and controlled, clear what I could, and commit to the ladder if things went wrong. I chose the third option because it kept the most variables in front of me. I checked my pack, tightened straps, made sure nothing would rattle. I shifted my rifle so it sat comfortably without snagging. Ammunition was limited. I reminded myself of that. Candy's lead stayed short. I didn't tell her to stay quiet. She already was. I approached from the side, where the slope dipped and the brush was thicker, moving one careful step at a time. The infected closest to the edge turned their heads when I shifted a loose branch, but none of them locked on. I froze until they drifted again. The smell was stronger now, heavy and layered. Old waste, spoiled food, rot from bodies that had been here longer than the rest. It clung to everything. The first trap I found was a snare rigged low, wire stretched between 2 stakes. It had been tripped and reset poorly. I stepped over it and marked the spot in my head. The second trap was a shallow pit covered with branches and ash. Someone had fallen in and clawed their way out, leaving blood smeared along the edge. Blood that had dried dark and flaky. I gave it a wide berth. As I edged closer, one of the infected wandered toward the tarp. It snagged on a loose line and pulled the whole thing down with a dull thump. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough. 2 others turned and shuffled over. They pressed against the fabric, pushing and pawing until it tore further. The smell intensified. I used the distraction to move. I was almost even with the first crate when a voice spoke up from somewhere I hadn't cleared. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a shout. It was a strained, hoarse sound, the kind that comes from someone who hasn't used their voice much lately. He said, "Don't move." That was all. Everything tightened at once. The infected reacted before I did. Heads turned toward the sound. Bodies pivoted with sudden focus. Candy tried to lean forward, confused by the change, and I had to anchor her with my weight. I didn't answer the voice. Answering turns a moment into a conversation, and conversations cost time. The man spoke again, louder now, panic creeping in. He said something about food, about not wanting trouble. His words spilled out unevenly, bouncing off debris and trees. Each syllable pulled the infected closer to him. I caught a glimpse of movement behind a crate near the fence line. A shoulder, a hand gripping something long and metallic. A pipe or a tool, not a firearm, at least not one I could see. I made a decision that felt ugly and necessary at the same time. I shifted my position just enough to kick a loose piece of scrap metal downhill, away from me and away from the tower ladder. It clattered against a crate and rolled, making noise that carried. The infected nearest the voice hesitated, then turned toward the new sound. It bought seconds. Seconds matter. The man yelled then, full voice. Fear stripped any control he had left. He shouted for help, for me to stop, for something that didn't exist anymore. The infected rushed him. I didn't watch the end. Watching would have frozen me in place. I moved. I broke into a controlled run toward the base of the tower, keeping low, using the ladder as my focus point. One infected peeled off and lunged in my direction, faster than the others. It stumbled over a crate and went down hard, long enough for me to pass without contact. Candy stayed tight to my leg, nails scraping on wood and ash. I reached the ladder and grabbed the first rung, testing it with my weight before committing. Solid. I pulled Candy up against the base, wrapped the lead around my wrist twice, and started climbing. The ladder vibrated as weight shifted below. Hands slapped against the metal, uncoordinated, reaching without understanding. The sound carried straight up the structure, a hollow ringing that made my teeth ache. I climbed steady, not fast. Fast leads to mistakes. Candy scrambled as far as the ladder allowed, then I lifted her by the harness handle, rung by rung, muscles burning in a way that told me I wouldn't get many chances like this. Something struck the ladder below, hard enough to shake it. I didn't look down. At the top, I forced the hatch open with my shoulder and pulled us inside, slamming it shut behind me. I dropped the latch and leaned my weight into it until the vibrations settled. The noise below continued, but it was distant now, filtered through metal and height. The inside of the cab smelled like death, old and layered, rot that had soaked into wood and fabric. Flies scattered when I moved. I didn't sit. I didn't rest. I checked corners, checked behind the stove, checked under the bench. I found bodies where they had fallen, slumped and stiff, eyes dull. Some had turned, some hadn't. I dealt with what I had to, quietly and close, using tools instead of ammunition. It took longer than I wanted, not because it was complicated, but because I forced myself to be careful. Rushing inside a closed space like this is how people get surprised by something that should have been obvious. I used the pry bar first, then the knife when I had to. I kept my weight low and my back to solid walls whenever possible. Candy stayed pressed against my leg, body tense but silent. She didn't try to interfere. She'd seen enough by then to know when stillness mattered. When it was done, the cab felt emptier, but not clean. You can't clean a place like that quickly. You can only reduce the risk. I dragged the bodies toward the far corner, stacked them away from the stove and the hatch, and covered them with an old canvas tarp I found folded under the bench. The tarp was stiff with dried stains, but it was better than leaving everything exposed. I opened the windows wide to let air move through, even though I knew the smell would linger. Some things don't leave once they've settled in. I finally allowed myself to stop moving and take stock. The cab was intact. The structure groaned when the wind shifted, but the bolts were solid and the floor didn't sag under my weight. The stove sat against the wall where I remembered it from years ago. Old but usable. The flue looked clear. There was a stack of split wood in a crate near the door, half rotted, but some pieces were still solid enough to burn. A narrow counter ran along one wall with shelves above it, most of them empty or knocked crooked. A table sat bolted to the floor, its surface scarred with knife marks and burn circles from careless cooking. I checked the storage lockers next. One held old lookout gear, weather logs from years back, maps pinned and repinned so many times the corners had turned to pulp. Another held what the last group had brought up here, a mess of mismatched supplies, empty packaging, a few sealed containers that rattled when I shook them. I didn't open everything right away. Inventory comes later. First, I needed to make sure nothing else in here could move. The noise below had settled into a steady rhythm, hands against metal, occasional dull impacts as bodies leaned into the ladder and lost balance. They couldn't climb, not really, but they didn't understand that. They would stay until something else pulled them away, or until time wore them down. I moved to the window and looked down carefully, keeping my head back from the frame. The infected clustered around the base, 5 that I'd counted earlier, and at least 2 more drawn in by the shouting and the ladder noise. They pressed against each other, jaws working, eyes unfocused. I closed the window partway, not enough to block air, but enough to reduce sound and scent leaking out. Candy followed my movement, positioning herself where she could see me and the hatch at the same time. I scratched her shoulder once, slow and deliberate. It wasn't comfort. It was reassurance. For both of us. Only after that did I let myself sit on the bench. My legs shook for a moment before settling. I took my pack off carefully and leaned it against the wall where I could grab it fast if I had to. I drank water in measured swallows, not letting myself drain the bottle. I'd learned that lesson the hard way weeks earlier, walking through a dry stretch and realizing too late that thirst lies to you. Candy drank next. I wiped her muzzle with a scrap of cloth and checked her paws again. The tape was holding, but I could see where the pads were worn thin. We'd need rest soon, whether I liked it or not. As the light outside faded, I did another sweep of the cab, this time slower, more methodical. I checked the hatch latch twice and added a secondary block using a length of wood wedged tight against the frame. It wouldn't stop a determined human, but it would slow anything else. I secured loose items that could rattle if the structure shook. The last thing I wanted was to advertise my presence with unnecessary noise. I found the solar setup tucked against the far wall, A small charge controller mounted crooked, wires leading down through the floor to a battery box bolted near one corner. The panel itself was outside, angled toward the south, visible through one of the windows. I didn't touch it yet. Electrical systems fail quietly until they don't, and I didn't want sparks or sudden light until I understood what I was dealing with. There was communication equipment too. Old radios, handheld and base units stacked in a crate. Most looked dead, broken antennas, corroded contacts. One base unit had a cracked casing and smelled faintly burned. I set them aside for later. No point dreaming about voices when I couldn't even be sure the power worked. Night came fast once the sun dipped. The clearing below disappeared into shadow, but the sounds didn't. The infected kept working at the ladder, scraping and bumping. Every so often one would fall, thudding against the ground hard enough to make the structure vibrate. Each vibration traveled up through the bolts and into the floor beneath my boots. I stayed alert, watching the ladder through the window, listening for any change in pattern that might mean something worse was coming. Sometime after dark, the noises thinned. One by one, the infected drifted away, pulled by something I couldn't see or hear. Maybe a distant sound. Maybe nothing more than instinct shifting direction. I didn't relax when it happened. Quiet can be more dangerous than noise. I waited until the ladder stood empty for a full half hour before allowing myself to move freely again. I lit the stove carefully, using the smallest flame possible. The wood smoked at first, damp and sour, but eventually caught enough to give heat without a bright glow. I warmed water and ate a small portion of food, chewing slowly, listening between bites. Candy lay curled near the bench, eyes open, tracking every sound. She didn't sleep deeply. Neither did I. I didn't dream that night. I drifted in and out of shallow rest, waking at every creak of the structure, every gust of wind that pushed against the cab. Each time, I reoriented myself, checked the hatch, checked the windows, checked Candy. By the time the sky lightened, I felt like I'd been awake for days, but I was still functional. That was enough. Morning light showed me the full extent of the mess below. The clearing looked worse in daylight. More bodies than I'd counted. At least one human corpse near the fence line, twisted at an angle that told me how it had ended. The tarp lay shredded, its contents scattered and trampled. Traps lay sprung and useless. The infected that remained wandered without focus, fewer than before but still enough to make the ground unsafe. I knew I couldn't leave things like this. The smell would draw more. The bodies would turn if they hadn't already. This tower could work, but only if I controlled what happened around it. That meant work, dangerous work, work that would put me back on the ground. Before that, I inventoried weapons. One modern rifle leaned against the wall near the door, cleaned but not well cared for. Two pistols lay wrapped in cloth in a locker, one in better shape than the other. An old rifle sat beneath the bench, wood stock cracked but action smooth. Ammunition was limited, enough to defend myself in a bad situation, not enough to solve problems with noise. I cleaned what needed cleaning, checked function, and put everything back where I could reach it fast. I spent the rest of the morning improving the interior, moving supplies into order, securing shelves, setting aside anything that could be used as a tool or weapon. I found notebooks in a crate, pages filled with cramped writing, names, dates, short entries about patrols, arguments, plans that never finished. I didn't read them all. Not yet. The dead didn't need an audience, and I didn't need their mistakes in my head while I was still making my own. By midday, the heat built inside the cab. I adjusted the windows to keep air moving without opening them fully. Candy drank again. I ate again. I checked the ladder from above, studying how it attached to the structure, where it flexed, where it might fail if stressed. I thought about ways to slow anything that tried to climb, ways to make noise work for me instead of against me. Eventually, I geared up to go down. There was no avoiding it. I couldn't secure the area from above alone. I waited for the infected to drift as far from the base as they were going to. I watched the wind. I chose a moment when the clearing was as empty as it would get. Before opening the hatch, I knelt in front of Candy and rested my forehead against hers for a second. I didn't say anything. Words don't change outcomes. I tightened her harness, shortened the lead, and clipped it to my belt instead of my wrist so I could use both hands. The ladder felt longer on the way down. Every rung creaked louder than it had on the climb. I paused halfway, listening. Nothing close. I continued. When my boots hit the ground, the smell hit harder than before. Sun on rot makes everything worse. I worked fast but not sloppy. I dragged bodies away from the base of the tower first, putting distance between them and the ladder. I used a tarp and rope to move more than one at a time when I could, avoiding contact as much as possible. Some stirred. I ended that quickly. Candy stayed behind me, body rigid, eyes tracking everything that moved. I didn't try to clean the entire clearing. That would have been pointless. I focused on creating a buffer zone, clear ground near the tower, less scent, fewer visual cues that something valuable stood here. I pushed debris downhill, away from the structure, using gravity to do the work when possible. When it was done, I was filthy and exhausted. My arms shook when I climbed back up the ladder. I secured the hatch behind me and leaned against it until the shaking stopped. Candy collapsed onto the floor beside me, panting lightly, then went still. I didn't move right away. I stayed there, back against the hatch, counting slow breaths, listening to the structure settle and the forest resume its quiet rhythm. Nothing else moved inside the cab. That mattered. I cleaned myself in stages, not because I wanted to feel better, but because dirt and blood turn into infections if you ignore them. I wiped my hands and forearms with a damp cloth, then cleaned under my nails with the tip of a knife. I changed my outer shirt and hung the dirty one near an open window, where air could reach it without advertising scent too far. I checked Candy next. Her coat was matted with ash and grime. I brushed what I could with my fingers and a scrap of cloth, checked her paws again, and replaced the tape on one pad that had started to bleed through. She accepted it without fuss. She trusted the routine. Only after that did I sit and eat properly. I heated water on the stove, careful not to let the flame get too strong. Smoke draws eyes, even when people don't mean to look. I ate slowly, forcing myself not to rush. Hunger lies. It tells you to eat everything now and worry later. I'd learned to ignore that voice weeks earlier. Candy ate after me. I watched her while she did, because animals get sick faster than people if something's wrong with the water or food. She was fine. Once my hands stopped shaking, I went back to the solar setup. I couldn't avoid it forever. Power wasn't a luxury here. It was control. I shut the windows closest to the panel to cut glare and knelt by the battery box. The lid was warped, screws stripped from being over-tightened. I eased it open instead of forcing it. Inside, the battery terminals were corroded, green, and crusted, the kind of buildup that comes from moisture and neglect. The charge controller light was dead. That didn't tell me much by itself. Dead systems don't announce why they failed. I disconnected everything slowly, marking wire positions with bits of tape torn from a notebook margin. Mixing connections by guessing is how you ruin equipment you might not replace. I cleaned the terminals with what little abrasive I had, scraping until metal showed through again. The battery casing was intact, no bulging, no cracks. That was good. I tested voltage with a small meter I'd carried since my maintenance days. Low, but not zero. That meant the battery wasn't gone yet. I followed the wires up to where they ran through the floor and out to the panel. The panel itself was dirty, coated in ash and bird waste, tilted slightly off angle. Someone had adjusted it and never checked their work. I made a mental note to go outside later and clean it properly, but not today. Going back down twice in one day was asking for trouble. I reconnected everything carefully, tightened what I could, and watched the controller when I exposed it to light. After a few seconds, a weak indicator flickered on. Not strong, not stable, but alive. That changed the math. Weak power meant limited options, but options all the same. I didn't plug anything in yet. I let it charge for an hour while I did other work, checking occasionally to make sure nothing overheated or sparked. Fires end stories fast, and not in ways that matter. Next came the radios. I laid them out on the table, one by one, and went through them like I used to go through equipment cages at work. Clean contacts, check switches, Look for obvious damage. Most were dead beyond simple fixes. One handheld crackled faintly when I powered it from a battery pack. Static only, no voices. That didn't surprise me. It still mattered. Static means something downstream is still alive. I didn't try to broadcast. Broadcasting is how you invite people who don't want to announce themselves. I set the radio aside and turned my attention back to the outside. The clearing below stayed quiet for most of the afternoon. No new movement. No new bodies drifting in. That meant the work I'd done helped, at least for now. As the day wore on, I noticed something else. The tower had blind spots. Not just visual ones, but sound ones. Certain angles where wind curled around the structure and carried noise up instead of away. Certain points on the slope where footsteps wouldn't reach the cab until someone was already close. I marked those areas mentally. High ground doesn't make you safe. It just gives you more time if you pay attention. Late afternoon, Candy lifted her head and stared toward the western tree line. She didn't growl. She didn't bark. Her ears locked forward and her body stiffened in a way I'd learned to trust. I moved to the window slowly and followed her line of sight. At first, I saw nothing. Then I saw movement that didn't fit the infected patterns. Too smooth, too deliberate. Someone was out there, using cover, stopping when the wind shifted. I didn't react right away. I watched. The movement stayed low, slow, careful. One person, maybe two. Hard to tell through the brush. No shouting, no careless noise. That told me more than any weapon could have. Whoever it was, he wasn't desperate yet. He was curious. I backed away from the window and adjusted the interior again, moving anything reflective out of sight, dampening anything that might rattle. Candy followed every movement, waiting for cues. I clipped her lead to a fixed point near the bench instead of my belt. If something went wrong, I needed both hands free. The figure never fully revealed himself. After an hour, the movement faded back into the trees. That didn't mean he left. It meant he didn't want to be seen. I marked the time in my head and stayed alert until dark. That night, I didn't light the stove. Cold is quieter than fire. I ate dry food and drank sparingly. Candy slept lightly, lifting her head at every sound. I sat with my back to the wall and watched the ladder through the window, rifle resting across my knees without being aimed. Aimed weapons make noise when you flinch. Sometime after midnight, a rock struck the base of the ladder. Not hard, just enough to make metal ring. Then another, farther out, like someone testing distance. The infected didn't respond. That meant the sounds were controlled, not chaotic. Human. I stayed still. Silence is an answer sometimes. Whoever it was waited. Then came a low voice from the darkness. He said he wasn't looking for trouble. He said he just wanted to talk. His tone was practiced, calm in a way that didn't match the situation. I didn't answer. Talking down from a tower puts you at a disadvantage. You give away position, tone, state of mind. He waited longer, then tried again, saying he'd seen the cleanup work and figured someone competent had moved in. He said he had supplies. He said he could trade. I shifted my weight slightly so he'd hear the floor creak. Not words, just proof of life. Candy tensed but stayed silent. The voice stopped. I heard movement retreating. Not fast, not panicked, calculated. Sleep didn't come easily after that. I replayed angles, distances, timing. One person scouting turns into more if you let it. The tower wasn't invisible anymore. That meant my next steps mattered even more. Morning came clear and cold. I checked the solar system first thing. The charge held overnight. Not much, but enough to confirm the battery wasn't bleeding out. I cleaned the panel from inside with a long brush through the open window, knocking loose ash and grime. The indicator steadied a little. Progress. I ate, drank, checked Candy, then sat with the notebooks I'd found earlier. I read them this time. Not all at once. Enough to understand what had happened. The group had started with good intentions. Patrol schedules, noise discipline rules, plans to fix the fence properly, then arguments. Short entries about missing food, accusations. Someone bringing strangers up without clearing it first. The last entries were scattered, handwriting uneven, dates skipped. Fear shows in how people write. I closed the notebook and put it away. I didn't need their mistakes living rent-free in my head. I needed to decide whether this tower was worth defending long-term or just a stop on the way to something else. By midday, I had my answer, even if I didn't like it. The tower worked. Not perfectly, not safely, but it worked. That meant staying would bring attention. Leaving would mean starting over with less strength than before. I chose to stay, at least for now. That meant changing how the place looked from the ground. No obvious signs of activity, no straight paths, no neat camps. I'd learned in the city that order attracts people. Mess gets ignored. I spent the afternoon making small changes that wouldn't be obvious from below, adjusting the ladder's lower section so it flexed more under weight, adding loose elements that would make noise if disturbed. Nothing dramatic, nothing that screamed trap, just inconveniences that bought seconds. As evening came on, I stood at the window and watched the tree line where I'd seen movement the day before. Nothing stirred. That didn't comfort me. It told me someone out there was patient. Patience is worse than panic. Panic makes noise. Patience waits for mistakes. I closed the window most of the way and shifted my focus back inside. Staring into the trees wouldn't solve anything tonight. What would matter was whether I could make this place livable without turning it into a beacon. The tower didn't need to be comfortable. It needed to be predictable. Predictable systems fail slower. I started with food. Not the long-term question yet. Just what I had, and how fast it would disappear. I laid everything out on the table. Dried grains, sealed packets, a few cans that had survived the walk, odds and ends scavenged from the camp below that were still safe to eat. Not much. Enough for a short stretch if I stayed disciplined. Candy's food mattered more in some ways. I could eat things she couldn't. If she went down, my odds followed her. Water came next. The tower had a small catchment barrel strapped to the outside, fed by a gutter that wrapped part of the roof. It wasn't full, but it wasn't empty either. The lid fit poorly, and insects had found their way in. I filtered and boiled what I needed, then cleaned the barrel as best I could from inside, using a long brush and careful movements through the window. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than trusting streams in burned ground below. Once the basics were sorted, I worked on the interior layout. Everything useful went where I could reach it without crossing the room. Heavy items stayed low. Tools stayed visible. Weapons stayed secured but accessible. I moved the bench closer to the stove so heat would reach where I slept without needing a bigger fire. Candy's spot ended up tucked against the wall opposite the windows, where drafts were weakest. That night, I allowed myself to feel the warmth properly for the first time since reaching the tower. Not comfort, just heat that didn't feel temporary. The stove ticked softly as it settled. The structure creaked when the wind shifted, but it wasn't the alarming kind. It was the sound of something old doing what it was built to do. Morning came clear. No voices, no rocks. No movement in the clearing, except two infected drifting along the fence line, slower than before. One stumbled and went down, struggled for a while, then went still. I didn't intervene. Nature finishes what impatience starts. I spent the morning pulling anything useful up from the camp that I'd missed before. Rope, nails, wire, a dented cooking pot, a small hatchet with a loose head that I could fix. I moved carefully, choosing moments when the infected were farthest away. I didn't rush. I'd learned that hurrying on the ground leads to sloppy noise. On my third trip down, I noticed something new. A rabbit, caught clean in one of the old snares near the edge of the clearing. It hadn't struggled much, neck broken, fresh. That told me two things. First, the area still had small game despite the fire and rot. Second, the trap still worked, even after everything else had gone wrong here. I reset the snare properly this time, adjusting the height and tension the way it should have been done originally. I marked it subtly so I wouldn't blunder into it later. I took the rabbit with me, keeping it wrapped tight to limit scent. Candy watched every movement, ears forward, eyes fixed. I made her sit and wait before we climbed. Dogs don't understand restraint unless you practice it. Back in the cab, I dealt with the rabbit immediately. No waiting. No pretending it would stay fresh. I cleaned it over a bucket, keeping waste contained, then sealed the remains in a bag to be disposed of later, far from the tower. I cooked part of it right away, small portions, low heat. The rest I salted lightly and hung near the stove where warmth and air could reach it without drawing attention outside. That meal changed the tone of the day, not because it was luxurious, but because it was earned, trapped, prepared, eaten without noise or waste. Candy ate her share and settled afterward with a heaviness that meant contentment, not exhaustion. That mattered more than calories. I spent the afternoon improving defenses in ways that wouldn't announce themselves. I added wire loops near the ladder base that would catch on clothing or gear and make noise without stopping movement completely. I loosened a few boards near the ladder attachment so weight would make them complain. I adjusted the hatch block so it could be dropped faster from inside. I also worked on my routine. When to eat, when to check outside, when to rest. The tower started to feel less like a borrowed space and more like a system I understood. That familiarity reduced mistakes. It also reduced panic. Panic wastes energy. The infected stayed sparse. A few wandered through over the next 2 days, drawn by old scent but not enough to gather. Each time I waited them out. No shots, no shouting, no unnecessary movement. They drifted on eventually, pulled by something else they couldn't explain. I added 2 more snares along a game trail I spotted beyond the clearing, far enough that any catch wouldn't draw attention to the tower itself. I checked them at odd hours instead of on a schedule. Patterns get noticed. Inside, I consolidated supplies. Anything I wasn't going to use soon got sealed and stowed. I labeled containers in pencil so I wouldn't forget what was where. Tooth pain, stomach trouble, infected cuts. Those were the things that ended people quietly. Staying ahead of them mattered. By the 4th night, the tower felt warmer. Not just from the stove, from use, from familiarity. Candy slept deeper, only lifting her head when something truly changed outside. I slept longer stretches too, though never deeply enough to forget where I was. That didn't mean things were safe. It meant they were stable. Stability attracts attention if you let it. I kept the windows dark. I cooked at odd hours. I left no obvious sign below that anyone lived above. On the 5th morning, I found another rabbit in the snare. Smaller this time, still clean, still useful. I thanked the silence, reset the trap, and climbed back up with the weight balanced carefully so it wouldn't swing. Standing at the window later that day, chewing slowly, I looked out over the slope and the thinning smoke haze in the distance. For the first time since leaving the city, I wasn't reacting. I was maintaining. That didn't mean the danger was gone. It meant I had room to think. Thinking felt strange after months of living minute to minute, but it was necessary. This place would either become a dead end or a foundation, and the difference depended on choices I made before pressure returned. The first thing I did was force myself to stop assuming silence meant safety. Silence only meant no one was making mistakes nearby. I spent the rest of that afternoon studying the land the way I used to study work sites. Slopes, drainage lines, tree density. The way sound traveled when the wind shifted. I opened one window at a time, listened, then closed it again. Certain angles carried noise straight up the tower. Others swallowed it. I marked those directions in my head and adjusted where I cooked, where I moved, where I stored anything that might smell. Food stayed at the front of my mind, even when I tried to push it aside. Rabbits were luck, not a plan. Snares fail. Animals disappear. Candy needed steady calories, not occasional wins. I rationed carefully and kept notes in a small notebook. Not dates, just tallies. What went in, what went out. Guessing kills slower than gunfire, but it still kills. Water was better, but not guaranteed. The catchment would work as long as weather cooperated and nothing fouled it. I added a simple screen from spare mesh to keep debris out and tightened the lid so insects couldn't crawl inside as easily. Every time I filled a container, I filtered and boiled. No shortcuts. Stomach trouble takes people out quietly, and quietly means alone. That night, I heard movement again in the trees, farther out this time. Not close enough to threaten, not loud enough to draw the infected. just presence. Candy noticed it too. She didn't bark. She didn't growl. She stood and watched, muscles tight, ears forward. I stayed still with her, letting the sound pass without acknowledging it. Whoever it was wanted to know if I'd react. I didn't give him that. The next morning, I found fresh tracks near one of the old trap sites. Human, careful steps. Someone circling wide, staying downwind, testing how much I controlled the ground. He didn't touch anything. That told me he wasn't desperate yet. Desperate people grab what they can and run. This person was measuring. I responded by changing nothing obvious and everything subtle. I checked snares at irregular times. I cooked when the wind favored me instead of on a routine. I moved supplies around so no pattern showed through the windows. I wanted the tower to look inactive from the ground, even while it stayed functional inside. By midday, 2 infected wandered into the clearing from the north. They were slower than the earlier ones, joints stiff, clothing half rotted away. I watched them for a long time before doing anything. They drifted close to the ladder, then lost interest and moved on. That confirmed what I suspected. The scent level had dropped enough that the area wasn't a magnet anymore. That was progress I could build on. I spent that afternoon reinforcing the small things that fail first. I tightened bolts where the ladder met the structure. I added a secondary catch to the hatch using salvaged hardware, something that could be engaged silently from inside. I adjusted the angle of the panel another few degrees and secured it better against wind. Nothing dramatic, just corrections. Candy got a longer rest period that day. She needed it. A tired dog makes noise. I brushed her coat thoroughly and checked her ears and teeth. She leaned into it, eyes half closed, trusting the routine. That trust carried weight. I didn't take it lightly. Late afternoon brought the first real problem I couldn't ignore. A group of 3 infected emerged from the west, moving faster than the others had. Not sprinting, but purposeful. Newer, less degraded. They followed a loose line that suggested they'd caught something on the wind. I closed the windows fully and stayed back from the frames. The tower stayed quiet. They reached the clearing and stalled, circling, heads lifting and turning. One bumped into the ladder and grabbed it. The structure rang softly. I didn't move. After a minute, the sound stopped. Another minute passed. Then they drifted off together, pulled away by something else. That told me I was still ahead of the curve, but not by much. That evening, I made a decision about the radios. Waiting for perfect power wasn't realistic. I connected one base unit and powered it briefly, just long enough to scan. Static. A burst of noise that might have been distant interference, or might have been nothing. I shut it down immediately. Broadcasting would wait. Listening was enough for now. The night passed without incident, but sleep didn't come easily. I replayed the infected movements in my head, matching them to wind shifts and time of day. Patterns emerge if you pay attention long enough. I needed those patterns if I was going to stay. The following morning, I caught sight of the Watcher again. Not close, just a silhouette moving through the trees beyond the ridge. He didn't approach, he didn't signal. He just stayed long enough to confirm I was still here. I let him see movement this time. Nothing aggressive, just enough to confirm the tower wasn't abandoned. Sometimes ambiguity invites more testing. Clarity can shut that down. Food luck held for another day. A squirrel this time, caught in a higher snare. Smaller yield, more work. I handled it the same way, clean and controlled. Waste sealed and removed. Meat cooked and dried carefully. Candy ate well again. Her energy came back in small but noticeable ways. She watched the forest with sharper focus, not the dull edge of hunger. As the days stacked, the tower began to feel less temporary. I knew every sound it made. Every creak had context. That familiarity was dangerous in its own way. Comfort dulls caution. I fought that by changing small things daily. Sleeping position, observation angles, meal timing. It kept me alert. On the 7th day since I'd reached the tower, the patient watcher finally made contact. Not by climbing, not by shouting. He left something at the edge of the clearing, far from the ladder, a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He didn't wait for me to come down. He retreated immediately, leaving the item in plain sight. I didn't rush. I watched the bundle from above for hours, checking for movement, checking for wires or obvious traps. Nothing shifted. Eventually, when the light was right and the wind steady, I went down alone. Candy clipped close, senses tight. I moved slow and wide, not straight toward it, stepping where the ground was clean and where I could see my own footprints. I didn't want to give anyone an easy line to follow back to the ladder. Up close, the bundle wasn't a trade offering. The cloth was tied tight with cord that looked reused and greasy, and the knot was deliberate. I used the tip of my knife to lift it instead of my fingers. No wires, no hidden weight shift, no sudden tension. I set it on a flat board and opened it from the far side. Inside were human fingers, dried, pale, cut clean, set in a row as if someone wanted them counted. Under them, on the inside of the cloth, someone had written in dark, dried smear, the letters uneven but readable, "Death is death." I didn't stare. I didn't let myself freeze. I closed the cloth back up with the knife and stepped away from it as if it could still bite. Candy made a low sound in her throat, not a bark, more a warning she tried to swallow. I tightened the lead and guided her back toward the ladder, not running, not rushing. If someone wanted my attention, he already had it. If someone wanted me down here, he'd get me down here again if I acted angry and stupid. I climbed back up and shut the hatch behind us, double-latched it, then blocked it. Only then did I let my hands shake for a second before forcing them steady. I cleaned the table again, not because it needed it, but because I needed to do something that made the inside feel controlled. I checked Candy's paws, then her ears, then her teeth. Routine gave my brain something to grip. When I went back to the window, I didn't scan for infected first. I scanned for the living. The clearing looked empty, but empty meant nothing now. Whoever left that bundle wanted one thing, to tell me there was a person out there who didn't trade, didn't negotiate, and didn't care about the usual rules. I waited until the sun shifted again, then I went back down, not to fetch the bundle, but to read the ground. I stayed near the tower base, eyes on dirt and ash. Someone had approached from the west, circled wide, and stood for a while in one spot where the grass was trampled flat. The footprints were heavy, the stride was long. The toes dug deeper than normal, like the person carried weight differently. No backpack drag, no heel scuff from fatigue. Whoever it was had come up here fresh. I followed the tracks only far enough to confirm direction, then stopped. Following someone into trees on his terms is how people vanish. I backed up my own prints on the way back, stepping into them again to muddy the edges. It wouldn't fool a skilled tracker, but it would slow casual eyes. I climbed back up and watched the tree line for the rest of the day without letting my face touch the glass. Candy stayed quiet beside me, body taut, eyes pinned to the same strip of forest. The man appeared near dusk. Not close at first, just a shape moving through the burned understory, stepping over deadfall without hesitation. When he came into a clearer patch, I saw him properly. He was large, taller than me, and broader in the shoulders. He wore animal skins, not as a costume, but as actual clothing that had been used hard and repaired more than once. No pack, no visible tools. His hair was long and matted. His face looked wrong in a way I couldn't explain with one detail. It still looked human, but his expression stayed fixed too long, and his eyes didn't track the world the way normal eyes do. He didn't move like an infected. He moved like a man who could choose where to put his feet. I didn't shout. I didn't wave. I cracked the window enough to speak without broadcasting my whole body. I kept the rifle low but ready. I told him to stop where he was and leave the tower area. I used a plain voice, not angry, not pleading. The man lifted his head and looked straight at the cab, as if he'd already memorized its shape. Then he grinned. Not a friendly grin, a deliberate one. He took another step forward. Candy barked once, sharp and loud, then tried to pull toward the window. I clamped the lead tighter around my forearm and said quiet through clenched teeth, forcing the word out with control instead of volume. Candy fought the command for a second, then stopped, trembling with energy. The man below didn't flinch at the bark. He seemed to enjoy it. He raised one hand and showed me something small between his fingers, then dropped it. I heard it hit the ground. Metal, a shell casing or a bolt, something meant to make a sound and prove he wasn't afraid of noise. I shut the window fully. If he wanted me talking, he wasn't getting it. I moved to the hatch and listened. The tower stayed quiet except for the wind. No infected gathering yet, which told me he'd chosen his approach carefully. He wasn't just violent, he understood timing. That made him worse. Minutes later, the ladder rang. Not from random hands, from someone climbing. The rhythm was too steady for the dead. I dropped to a knee, kept Candy behind me, and aimed at the hatch without putting my face over it. The structure vibrated as the man came up. I could hear his weight on the rungs. He didn't rush. He climbed with the confidence of someone who'd done it before or someone who didn't care if he fell. When his hands hit the hatch, he didn't try to pry quietly. He slammed it once, hard enough to rattle my teeth. The secondary block held. He slammed again, then laughed under his breath. It wasn't loud, but it carried through the wood. Candy made another tight sound and tried to shift forward. I anchored her by stepping on the lead near her harness. I kept my voice low and told her to stay. She stayed, shaking, eyes wide, focused on the hatch as if she could see through it. The man stopped slamming and started working the edges, scraping metal against wood. He was trying to find the latch. He was patient again. That told me he wasn't here to scare me off. He was here to take the place, or to take me, or both. I didn't have the option of waiting him out. If he got the hatch open even a few inches, I'd be fighting in the cab, and that was the worst place to fight. I moved to the window on the opposite side and looked down. The ladder was visible. The man was halfway up, one arm around the rung, the other hand on the side rail. His head tilted slightly as if he was listening to the building's tension. He wasn't climbing fast because he didn't need to. He believed he owned the time. I made the call I'd been avoiding since the city. I opened the hatch just enough to see the top rung, not enough to expose my chest. The man's face was close, angled up, grin still fixed. I told him to back down. He didn't answer. He lunged upward, grabbing for the gap. Candy barked again, full voice this time, and the sound punched out into the forest. I yanked the lead tighter, forcing her back, but the damage was done. The man got one hand on the hatch edge and pulled. I fired once. I aimed center mass because I am not a movie shooter, and I am not gambling on small targets. The shot was deafening inside the cab. The recoil shoved my shoulder back. The man jerked hard, lost his grip, and fell away from the hatch. I shut it instantly and dropped the latch and the block again. The ladder rang as his body hit it on the way down, then the thud of him hitting ground carried up through the structure. Candy kept barking, frantic now, pacing in a tight circle because she could smell the change and hear the aftermath. I grabbed her harness and forced her down beside the bench, one hand on her shoulder until she stopped moving. I didn't soothe her with words. Words don't reach a dog when adrenaline is high. Pressure and presence do. After a minute, she went silent, still trembling, ears pinned forward, listening. Below, the forest answered the gunshot. Not immediately, but soon. A distant chorus of rough, broken sounds, then movement through brush. The infected hadn't been close, but sound carries in this terrain. I went to the window and watched the clearing. 2 infected stumbled in from the north, then 3 more from the west, drawn in crooked lines. They moved faster than the old ones, not sprinting, but committed. Behind them came one that looked worse, shoulders hunched, head twitching, movements uneven in a way that suggested a body failing in a different direction than normal decay. I didn't have time to study it. I had time to prepare. The large man lay at the base of the ladder. He didn't move. I watched him for a long time, expecting the slow shift of reanimation, the twitching start, the wrong kind of breath. Nothing. I couldn't tell if he was dead in the ordinary way or dead in a way that would become a problem later. I couldn't go down to check. The infected were already converging. I spent the next hour managing noise and light, closing windows to cut scent, keeping Candy away from the frames, staying low. The infected gathered beneath the tower and around the fallen man, drawn by blood and sound. They bumped the ladder and slapped at it, climbing a rung or two, then dropping, repeating the cycle. The ladder rang over and over until it became a steady background hum. The tower held. The hatch held. My nerves held because they had to. Through the window, I watched one infected kneel awkwardly over the fallen man, tearing at his clothing. I didn't watch closely. I didn't need details. I needed outcomes. The outcome was that the man would not be climbing back up. That was one problem solved at a cost I didn't like. The other cost was the signal I'd sent to every living person within a few miles. Gunshot meant someone had something worth defending, or someone had lost control. Either way, it pulled attention. The infected stayed through the night. They didn't climb well, but they didn't have to. They just had to stay and keep the ladder loud. Sleep was impossible. I rotated positions, sat against different walls, kept my rifle close without aiming it constantly. Candy lay with her head on her paws, eyes open, body tense. She didn't whine. She didn't bark. She just watched the hatch and waited for the next wave of noise. Near morning, the infected began to drift. Some wandered off in pairs. Some fell and didn't get back up. The ones with more strength stayed longer, circling, lifting their heads as if searching for the source of the scent. When the sun finally cleared the ridge, only two remained, slow and uncertain. Then one, then none. The clearing fell quiet again, but it was a different quiet now. It felt watched. When I judged it safe enough, I went down. Not right away, and not alone. Candy came clipped close, but I kept her behind me and off to one side, where she could retreat without tangling us both. The clearing smelled worse than before. The fallen man was still there, but not intact. I did not study him. I forced my eyes to the ground and to the tree line, reading for threats. The tracks told me what mattered. The infected had come and gone. No other human had approached during the night. That was luck. Luck doesn't last. I handled the message bundle first. I carried it far from the tower, downwind, and buried it deep in ash soil where animals wouldn't dig easily. I didn't want it inside the cab. I didn't want it near the ladder. It wasn't a trophy. It was a warning from someone who wanted to shape my thinking. I refused to let it sit anywhere I lived. Then I dealt with the clearing. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to reduce scent again. I dragged what I could away from the base. I washed the ladder rungs with boiled water and ash paste, scrubbing where hands had left grime. It was work that felt pointless, but it wasn't. Scent control buys time. Time is what keeps you alive when you don't have a crowd. Back inside, I locked down the tower as if it was my job, because now it was. I adjusted the ladder lower section again, making it less stable without making it look tampered with. I added a simple noise line at the base using small metal bits on cord that would jingle if disturbed. I strengthened the hatch block and built a second one. I moved the sleeping bench so I could reach the hatch in one step instead of two. I kept Candy's lead clipped to a fixed point at night so she wouldn't rush a window if someone came close again. I thought about leaving. I thought about the first tower, burned and broken, and how easy it would be for this one to become the same if the wrong person decided to solve the problem with fire. I thought about the city, about how people there didn't run out of anger, they ran out of patience. I looked at Candy, at the way she watched me for cues, and I knew I wasn't walking away from another structure just because a violent man had found me first. If I kept moving every time danger appeared, I'd be moving until my legs failed. So I stayed, and I did the work that staying requires. I tightened my routine. I checked snares more often but never on a predictable schedule. I expanded the game line farther from the tower, so any catches didn't create a scent hotspot near my ladder. I improved water storage inside with sealed containers, and kept a rotating boil schedule so I always had safe water ready. I cleaned the solar panel properly the next clear day, and the charge stabilized enough that I could run a radio receiver in short bursts without draining everything. On the third night after the attack, I heard the forest shift again. Not infected, not wind, a person moving at the edge of hearing. Candy lifted her head, ears forward, but she stayed quiet this time. That told me she'd learned from the last mistake, and I'd learned from mine. I didn't speak. I didn't show light. I listened. In the morning, there were new tracks, lighter than the large man's, circling wide, stopping near the spot where the bundle had been. Whoever it was had come to see the aftermath and found nothing left for him to read. That was the point. I'd removed the story he wanted me to live inside. I'd turned it into ground and ash. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't planned to do so soon. I powered the radio receiver and scanned for a few minutes, then shut it down. Static, then a faint voice fragment, too broken to understand, then silence again. It wasn't rescue. It wasn't a conversation. It was proof that somewhere, someone still talked into empty air, hoping a person on the other end would answer. I didn't answer. Not yet. The tower had just announced itself with a gunshot days earlier. Adding my voice to the map would be another risk, and I wasn't ready to pay it. That night, I sat by the stove with Candy at my feet, eating a small portion of rabbit I dried and rehydrated, drinking boiled water that tasted flat but safe. The tower creaked in the wind. The forest stayed quiet. My hands were steady again. The fear didn't vanish, but it got organized. It became a checklist instead of a spiral. I didn't win something clean here. I didn't defeat the world or solve the outbreak or find a community waiting to welcome me. I held a ladder and a room and a routine. I kept my dog alive. I kept myself alive. I learned that not every human threat is a hungry neighbor or a desperate scavenger. Some people are broken in a different direction, and some infected change in ways you can't explain from a distance. The answer to all of it was the same. Pay attention, stay disciplined, and never let comfort turn into carelessness. When I finally lay down, Candy settled against my legs with a slow exhale, and I let my eyes close for longer than I had in weeks. The tower wasn't safe. Nothing was, but it was stable again, and stability meant tomorrow would start with choices instead of panic. That was enough. And that's where we'll stop for now. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell me how the story hit you, what moments worked, what didn't, and what you'd want to hear next. And a big thank you to everyone supporting the channel, especially with extra membership: Carlos Herrera, Dominique Johnson, The Great Anywho, Jade Allah, Madam Midnight, Deborah Powell, TJR, Baby Doll. You keep this project alive. Until next time, Survivor. Jack's Nightmares signing off.